I was 73 when my right hand went numb at the breakfast table. I remember staring at my coffee cup, watching it tilt, and thinking I'd somehow forgotten how gravity worked. When I tried to stand, my knee buckled and the room slid sideways, slow, quiet, unreal. I didn't feel pain at first. Just confusion. Words came out wrong when I called my daughter, Linda. Thick. Slurred. I heard her go still on the line. "Dad, where are you?" she asked. I told her I was at home. I told her something wasn't right. Then the phone slipped out of my hand. I woke up in the hospital with a nurse saying my name like she was calling me back from somewhere far off. "Stroke," she said. "Mild, but real. They caught it early." I was lucky. Lucky is a strange word when half your face won't quite obey you and your arm feels like it belongs to someone else. I asked about my family right away. The nurse hesitated, then said my daughter had called. She said Linda and my son, Mark, were out of state. On a cruise. Alaska. Planned for months. Non-refundable. That word landed heavier than the diagnosis. Linda came by video that evening. The ship's cabin was bright behind her, all polished wood and smiles she hadn't quite put on yet. She said she was so sorry. She said they'd talked it over. The doctors said I'd be okay. They didn't want to panic. Mark leaned into the frame and nodded, like this was all very reasonable. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just asked when they were coming home. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the ship's engine hum through the screen. Linda said, "Dad, it's only a few more days." After the call, the room felt very quiet. Machines beeped. A man down the hall groaned in his sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, realizing something had shifted. Not all at once. Just enough to notice. I'd spent a lifetime being steady so no one else had to be. Lying there, half numb and alone, I understood how easily that steadiness had been mistaken for not needing anyone at all. The days after the stroke blurred together in a way I'd never known before. Nurses came and went. A physical therapist lifted my arm and told me to squeeze her fingers. I tried. Nothing happened. She smiled anyway and said, "That's okay. We'll work on it." I nodded, pretending her optimism didn't scare me. At night, everything felt louder. The beeping monitors. The shuffle of shoes in the hallway. My own breathing, uneven and unfamiliar. I kept thinking about how easily I could have died at that breakfast table, alone with a cup of coffee and yesterday's newspaper. That thought didn't come with drama. Just a steady, dull weight. Linda called once a day from the ship. She told me about glaciers and whale sightings. She asked how therapy was going, the way people ask about the weather. Mark sent a text. "Hang in there, Dad." No punctuation. I stared at that message longer than I should have. On the third day, a social worker sat with me and talked about discharge plans. Did I have someone at home? Someone who could stay with me for a while? I hesitated before answering. I said my daughter lived an hour away. I didn't say she was on vacation. I didn't say I wasn't sure if I was supposed to ask. That afternoon, my sister Ruth came. She's younger than me, but she's always had that look of someone who expects to manage things. She brought clean socks and a worried face. She asked where my kids were. I told her. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat down hard in the chair and folded her hands. "Well," she finally said, "that's something." I shrugged with my good shoulder. They had it planned. Ruth looked at me the way she used to when we were kids and I was making excuses for people who didn't deserve them. "You always do this," she said quietly. "You always make it easier for everyone else." I didn't argue. I was too tired. And somewhere deep down, I knew she was right. That night, alone again, I practiced lifting my fingers. One twitched. Just barely. It felt like a small victory, but it also felt lonely. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped smoothing things over. The thought scared me, but it didn't go away. I was discharged 6 days later with a cane, a stack of papers, and instructions I barely remembered by the time Ruth drove me home. My house smelled the same as always. Lemon cleaner. Old books. A place that had been waiting for me without asking questions. I stood in the doorway longer than I needed to, steadying myself, realizing how close I'd come to never seeing it again. Ruth stayed the first night. She cooked soup and labeled my pill bottles in thick black marker. We didn't talk much. Every so often she'd look at me like she wanted to say something sharp, then thought better of it. When she left the next morning, she hugged me harder than usual. "Call me if you need anything," she said. I promised I would, though we both knew I probably wouldn't. Linda and Mark came back 2 days later. They stood in my living room with souvenirs still in their bags. A carved whale for me. A magnet. Linda cried when she saw the cane. Mark clapped my shoulder too hard and said, "You scared us, Dad." I believed he meant it, but I also noticed how quickly they started talking about work, about the flight home, about how exhausting travel was. Linda asked if I was mad. I said no. That was easier than explaining the knot that had settled somewhere behind my ribs. Mark said, "You know we'd drop everything if it was serious." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what serious meant anymore. They stayed less than an hour. Said they didn't want to tire me out. When the door closed, the house went quiet again. Not peaceful. Just empty. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to button my shirt with my weak hand. It took longer than it should have. I laughed once, softly, at how ridiculous it felt. Then the laughter stopped. For the first time since the stroke, I didn't think about recovery or therapy or being grateful. I thought about how many times I'd told myself not to make a fuss. How often I'd taught my kids that I'd always be fine. Sitting there alone, struggling with a simple button, I wondered if I'd trained them too well. The thought didn't feel like anger. It felt like clarity, and it stayed with me. Physical therapy started the next week. 3 mornings a week in a small room that smelled like disinfectant and effort. The therapist, a young man named Carlos, spoke to me like I was capable, which I appreciated more than I let on. He didn't rush me. He didn't pity me. He just said, "We'll see what your body remembers." Some days my hand listened. Some days it didn't. Progress was slow and uneven, the way real things usually are. I learned how tired I could get without warning. How pride could make things harder if I let it. I stopped trying to hide how much work it was just to get through a morning. Linda checked in every few days. She asked if I was doing my exercises. Mark sent articles about recovery like homework assignments. Neither of them offered to drive me. Neither of them asked if I was lonely. I told myself they were busy. I told myself a lot of things. One afternoon, I missed a step on the porch and sat down hard. Nothing broke. My pride took the worst of it. I sat there longer than necessary, feeling the cool concrete through my pants, waiting for the shaking to pass. A neighbor eventually came over and helped me up. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He just stayed until I was steady. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from pain, but from thinking. About how easily something small could have gone wrong. About how my kids would have found out later, after the fact. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger takes energy. What I felt was something quieter and heavier. The next morning, Linda called. She said she was planning another trip later in the year and wanted to check dates with me so I wouldn't feel left out. I listened to her talk, then I said, "I don't think I'll be available." She laughed, then realized I wasn't joking. There was a pause, the kind where both people are deciding how honest to be. I told her I needed to focus on myself for a while. I told her I couldn't keep pretending I was fine when I wasn't. She didn't argue. She sounded confused. A little hurt. We ended the call politely, like strangers who still shared a last name. Afterward, I sat in my chair and felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not relief. Not sadness. Resolve. For the first time since the stroke, I wasn't thinking about what they needed from me. I was thinking about what it would take for me to feel safe in my own life again. I started making small changes first. The kind no one else notices. I moved a chair closer to the bathroom so I wouldn't rush. I canceled a few standing commitments I'd kept out of habit more than desire. When Linda called and asked if I could watch the dog for a weekend, I said no. My voice didn't shake, but my hand did when I hung up. Therapy continued. Carlos noticed the difference before I did. "You're not apologizing as much," he said one morning, half smiling. I hadn't realized I'd been doing that. Apologizing for moving slowly. For needing help. For taking up space. Mark came by once, unannounced. He stood in the doorway like he was checking off a box. He told me work was crazy. He said he'd meant to come sooner. I believed him, and I didn't. Both at the same time. When he left, he hugged me and said, "Call if you need anything." I watched his car pull away and understood that calling wasn't the same as being answered. The hardest part wasn't the weakness in my arm. It was the quiet understanding that if something happened again, I might face it mostly alone. That thought used to scare me. Now it felt like information. Something I needed to work with instead of around. One afternoon, sitting by the window, I made a list. Not of grievances. Of needs. Rides to appointments. Someone to check in who actually meant it. A plan for the next emergency that didn't rely on wishful thinking. I called Ruth and asked if she'd help me figure it out. She said yes without hesitation. I let myself lean on that. Linda noticed the distance growing. She asked if she'd done something wrong. I told her the truth, gently. That I'd been hurt. That I needed more than reassurances after the fact. She went quiet. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize either. We were both learning what this new shape of things looked like. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the cane resting against the chair, the house steady around me. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't resolved to punish anyone. I was simply done pretending that love didn't require showing up. And for the first time since the stroke, that felt like choosing myself. The letter from the insurance company came on a Tuesday. Dense language. Small print. A reminder that recovery wasn't just physical, it was paperwork and phone calls and waiting on hold. I sat at the table with it spread out, my hand tired halfway through the first page. For years, Linda handled these things for me. Or at least I thought she did. Looking at that letter, I realized how much I'd let drift simply because it was easier to let someone else feel important. I called her that afternoon and asked if she could come with me to an appointment the next week. There was a pause, not long, but familiar. She said she'd have to check her schedule. I told her it was fine if she couldn't. I meant it. When we hung up, I wrote the appointment down and circled it. I called Ruth next. She said, "I'll be there," before I finished the sentence. That difference stayed with me. A few days later, Mark sent photos from the cruise he'd finally posted online. Glaciers. Smiling faces. A drink with an umbrella in it. I looked at them longer than I needed to. Not with anger. With something closer to grief. Not for the trip I'd missed, but for the moment I'd needed them and they'd chosen something else. When Linda finally came by again, weeks later, she noticed the changes. The chair placement. The pill organizer. The notes on the fridge. She asked who was helping me with all this. I said, I am. Then I added, and Ruth. Linda nodded, like she wasn't sure where she fit into that sentence. We sat together without the television on. That hadn't happened in years. She told me she hadn't known how serious the stroke had been. I believed her. I also told her that not knowing didn't erase how it felt. She cried then. Quietly. I didn't rush to fix it. I let the silence do its work. I didn't ask for promises. I didn't need them. What I needed was honesty, and I finally had enough of my own to recognize it. That night, after she left, I stood at the bathroom mirror and practiced lifting my arm. It rose higher than it had before. Not much. Enough. I watched my reflection, older than I remembered, steadier than I expected. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for calls. Not for reassurance. Not for someone to decide I mattered. The stroke had taken things from me. That was real. But it had also shown me something just as real. My life was still mine to organize, mine to protect. Sitting there in the quiet house, I understood that choosing myself didn't mean turning my back on family. It meant finally turning toward my own life with both eyes open. The invitation came folded inside a glossy envelope, the kind meant to feel generous. A family dinner. Linda's idea, according to the note. No occasion. Just togetherness. I held it for a long time before setting it down. My hand still ached when I gripped too tightly, and I took that as a reminder to be careful with more than just my body. I went, but I drove myself. I needed to know I could leave when I wanted to. The table was full. Food was warm. Conversation stayed light, carefully so. Mark joked. Linda hovered. Everyone avoided the word stroke like it might break something fragile. At one point, Linda reached for my arm and said, "You're doing great, Dad." I nodded and said thank you. I didn't say how close I'd come to needing help that never arrived. After dinner, Mark mentioned another trip they were thinking about. Not a cruise this time. Something shorter. He glanced at me like he was checking for permission. I told him to do what made sense for his life. He looked relieved. That told me more than the words ever could. When it was time to go, Linda walked me to the door. She asked if things were better now. I thought about it. About the cane in my car. About Ruth's number taped to my fridge. About the way my house felt less like a waiting room and more like a home again. I said, "They're clearer." Driving home, I didn't feel angry or abandoned. I felt older, yes, but also steadier. Some things had been taken from me that morning at the breakfast table. But some things had been returned, too. The understanding that my time mattered. That my care was my responsibility first. I pulled into my driveway, shut off the engine, and sat there a moment in the quiet. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living within the limits I had, and that felt like enough. A few weeks later, my doctor asked if I had advance directives. Living will. Power of attorney. The kind of questions that land differently after you've already brushed up against the edge. I told him I wasn't sure. He nodded like he'd heard that 1,000 times and said, "Now's a good time." I didn't call my kids first. That was new. I called Ruth. We sat at my kitchen table with forms spread out between us, the afternoon light cutting across the paper. We talked slowly. About what I wanted. About what I didn't. About dignity. About not being kept alive by machines just because someone couldn't let go. It was sober, quiet work. Necessary. Linda found out later and sounded surprised. A little hurt. She asked why I hadn't included her. I told her the truth. That I needed to feel secure before I could feel generous. There was a pause, then she said she understood. I wasn't sure she did, but she was trying, and I let that count for something. My strength kept coming back in small, uneven steps. I could button my shirt now without thinking too hard. I walked the block without the cane on good days. On bad days, I used it and didn't apologize. That might have been the biggest change of all. Mark invited me to lunch one afternoon. Just the two of us. We talked about ordinary things. Work. Weather. He avoided the big topics, and I didn't chase him. When we stood to leave, he said, "I should have come home." He didn't say when. He didn't say why. But he said it. I nodded. That was enough for that moment. That evening, back at home, I put the paperwork in a folder and labeled it clearly. Not out of fear. Out of respect for myself. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the light fade the way it always had. Nothing dramatic. Just another day ending. I wasn't closing the door on my family. I was closing the gap where I'd been standing alone for too long. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, I felt something settle that hadn't been there before. Not bitterness. Not triumph. Just peace, earned slowly, the only way it ever really comes. The first anniversary of my stroke passed without ceremony. No calls marked the date. No one mentioned it at dinner or in passing. I noticed anyway. Dates like that lodged themselves in the body. My arm ached a little more that morning. The sky was gray. Ordinary. I made breakfast slowly and ate it at the table instead of standing at the counter like I used to. Coffee tasted the same. Toast burned a bit. Life had gone on, which was both comforting and quietly sobering. Survival doesn't announce itself. It just keeps happening. Linda and Mark still called. Not more. Not less. Just as they always had once things settled back into routine. I no longer waited for the phone to ring. I planned my days around what I could do, not what I might be asked to do. That change felt permanent in a way nothing else had. Ruth and I took a walk that afternoon. Not far. Just the park loop. She talked about her garden. I listened. Halfway through, she glanced at me and said, "You seem lighter." I thought about it, then nodded. "I am," I said. And I meant it. Later, alone again, I sat in my chair and watched the late sun move across the wall. I thought about that morning a year ago. The numbness. The fear. The way my family's absence had hurt more than the weakness in my body. I didn't excuse it anymore. I didn't carry it either. It had become part of the truth, and the truth no longer needed defending. I still loved my children. That never left. But love, I'd learned, didn't mean making myself small or silent. It didn't mean being endlessly available just so others could feel comfortable. Love could exist alongside boundaries. It could survive disappointment. That night, I set my cane by the door out of habit, even though I hadn't needed it all day. I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the quiet. My life wasn't what it had been. It was narrower, slower. But it was mine again. When my family chose a cruise over my stroke, something in me finally shifted. It took time to understand it. Even longer to accept it. But standing there in the dark, steady on my feet, I knew this much was true. I hadn't lost my family that day. I had found myself.